And so, there's been a robbery in the news studio at BBC Scotland. The chairs have disappeared and presenters are having to stand all the way through Reporting Scotland. It's not so bad, I guess, as the bosses have built a bar top to lean on. No pints, mind you, not one in sight. Audit Scotland concludes the government was unprepared for the pandemic. Alex Salmond says he's ready to face Holyrood committee next week. And it's the final week in the campaign to lead Labour in Scotland. From Caledonia Media, I'm Charles Fletcher with Scotland's favourite political show, The Week in Holyrood.
I want to be clear, though, to give particularly parents as much clarity as possible at this stage, that the need to properly assess the impact of this limited reopening means that we think it unlikely at this stage that there will be any further return to school before the 15th of March.
Matin va, fiskama. This week in Holyrood, the news parents have been waiting for, a partial return to school. The progress will be monitored ahead of any further resumption of classes, but the First Minister says Monday's start is on target.
I'm pleased to confirm today that, in keeping with the advice of our expert group, this first phase of the reopening of schools will go ahead as planned on Monday. Now, we will need to monitor the impact of this change very carefully before taking any further decisions. However, I hope we will be able to set out the second phase of school reopening in 2 weeks' time. I want to be clear, though, to give particularly parents as much clarity as possible at this stage, that the need to properly assess the impact of this limited reopening means that we think it unlikely at this stage that there will be any further return to school before the 15th of March. Now, as we consider these issues, we are, of course, doing everything we can to ensure that schools are as safe as possible for children and for the education workforce. As senior phase pupils, teachers and school staff start to return, we will be making at-home lateral flow tests available to them twice a week as part of a wider package of in-school mitigations. Comprehensive testing guidance has now been issued to schools and local authorities, and as of yesterday, more than 2,200 schools had received deliveries of test kits.
The First Minister says there is now compelling evidence the vaccine is working to reduce Scotland's death rate. Nicola Sturgeon says the Scottish Government's route map for easing restrictions, that's due to be published next week, will maintain a cautious approach. And she's hopeful there will be no further lockdowns.
It's very strong and compelling evidence now that vaccination is starting to work to reduce the number of people dying. Yesterday's National Records of Scotland figures show a 62% reduction in the number of COVID deaths which have taken place in care homes over the past 3 weeks. And that is a larger decline than we have seen for deaths happening in hospitals or in people's own homes. And as a result of that, the proportion of COVID deaths, the proportion of the overall number of people dying taking place in care homes, has fallen from 34% around the start of this year to 13% last week. And with the exception of 1 week at the end of August, when there were only 2 COVID deaths registered overall, care homes accounted for a smaller proportion of COVID deaths last week than at any time since March of last year. In other words, at any time since virtually the beginning of the pandemic. So that does give us quite strong confidence now that the early vaccination of care home residents and the focus on trying to maximise uptake within older people's care homes is now having the impact that we desperately hoped to see it have.
Labour and Tory leaders pounced on the First Minister this week, accusing her of failing to be ready to tackle the coronavirus pandemic. They claim she missed opportunities to protect Scotland. She says they're out of order and just don't get what she's handling day by day. Pandemic planning by the Scottish Government had focused on what would happen if a flu-type virus threatened to overwhelm. What emerged with COVID is something completely different. No European nation prepared for a virus attack like this. Conservative Group Leader Ruth Davidson.
Over the last 10 months and even before that, governments across the world have made mistakes in their planning for and handling of this pandemic. but today's report by Audit Scotland identifies a lack of preparedness on the part of the Scottish Government stretching back to over a decade. Specifically, it charges that SNP ministers failed to implement key recommendations made after pandemic planning exercises in 2015, 2016 and 2018. Between Exercise Silver Swan, Exercise Cygnus and Exercise Iris, these reports made 52 specific recommendations. Can I ask the First Minister how many of those recommendations had been implemented by the Scottish Government by March of 2020?
First Minister.
The Audit Scotland report this morning is important, as all Audit Scotland reports are, and the Government, as we always do, will pay very close attention to it. However, one of the key points, the paramount points that the report makes, and I'm going to quote from it here, is this one: the Scottish Government and the NHS responded quickly to the rapidly developing pandemic. Now, in terms of the three pandemic preparedness exercises, Silver Swan in 2015, Cygnus in 2016 and Exercise Iris in 2018. I don't have the full list of 52 recommendations in front of me here, but I'm happy to arrange for that information to be provided. But as a result of these exercises, a range of national and local pandemic guidance and plans were updated to take account of the lessons of these exercises. But one of the key points is this one, I think, and it's perhaps one that's not captured fully in the Audit Scotland report, is that what we found ourselves dealing with in February, March of this year was not a flu pandemic, and therefore no amount of preparedness for a flu pandemic would have been sufficient in the face of the situation that we actually encountered. However well prepared we'd been for flu, it became clear quite quickly that we were dealing with something of a completely different nature. And in fact, if I reflect back on the last 10 months, and of course this will be something for proper scrutiny in the fullness of time, I actually think the more valid criticism of both the Scottish Government and indeed governments across the Western world is that we relied perhaps in the early stages of the pandemic too much on flu preparations and perhaps hadn't done enough to prepare for the experiences of SARS-type outbreaks. So that's one of the key lessons I think that governments across certainly the Western world will have to learn, and of course we'll add that to the lessons that the Audit Scotland report has for us. But let me end this answer where I started. According to Audit Scotland, the Government and the NHS responded quickly to the rapidly developing pandemic.
Ruth Davidson.
It was no surprise, Presiding Officer, that the First Minister didn't want to give a number on those 52 recommendations that had been carried out, because the Audit Scotland report highlights a catalogue of missed opportunities on the part of the Scottish Government, including a failure to ensure the proper supply and use of personal protective equipment, or PPE. It makes clear that the PPE stockpile, and I quote, was not enough to fully meet the demands of the NHS. After the 2016 exercise, a working group identified access to PPE as a priority action to be completed by March of 2018. Then Exercise Iris, 2 years before the onset of the COVID pandemic, again warned the Government that it needed to up its game on PPE. We simply shouldn't have had NHS staff forced to work without adequate protection, reusing masks and having to beg for donations because PPE wasn't in place. First Minister, why didn't the Scottish Government act on the repeated warnings it received in this report, and in this report, when doing so would have meant that doctors, nurses and carers were properly protected?
First Minister.
You see, I simply don't accept the characterisation of Ruth Davidson there, and I don't believe it bears any real scrutiny. If you look at PPE in particular, Scotland has never once throughout this entire pandemic ran out of PPE. And in fact, not just that, we were in a position at an earlier stage of the pandemic to offer mutual aid to other parts of the UK. What we found was two things. Firstly, and if the Conservatives want to, these are really, really serious issues, and I think they do bear proper response and consideration. What we found, first of all, is that we had to improve, and we did improve, rapidly the distribution mechanisms for PPE to make sure that that got to the front line quickly. We did that with the NHS. We set up a portal so that anybody who had concerns could quickly raise those concerns and have them addressed. And of course, in addition to the NHS, we very quickly put new arrangements in place to top up the PPE supplies that were available to our care homes across the country. There was also some very detailed consideration that was required by experts, not by politicians, of the particular PPE needs, given, to go back to my earlier point, which can't just be glossed over in all of this, that we weren't dealing with a flu pandemic. We were dealing with a completely different beast, something that had the need or required, in some respects, a different response. So we took all of those steps. We continue to ensure that we have good supplies, robust supplies of the right PPE. And into the bargain, of course, we've also developed a domestic supply chain for PPE, not by giving contracts to our political chums the way some other governments have done, but actually by building that domestic supply chain. So before this pandemic, there was effectively zero Scottish PPE manufacturing. We were wholly reliant on imports. But over this winter period, nearly half of all PPE that's been used in Scotland is being supplied from Scotland. So there are, and I will be the last to ever try to deny this, there are lots of lessons for us to learn, and we have to do that properly as we go, but also when we come out of this pandemic. But actually, I think the steps that we have taken are the right ones, and we will continue to make sure that the NHS and wider society is properly equipped.
Ruth Davidson.
The First Minister stands there and tells us that there was no issue with PPE last year. Well, perhaps she wants to tell that to Scotland's nurses, half of whom told the RCN that they were forced to reuse single-use protection. But, Presiding Officer, tragically, Scotland's care homes have seen over a third of Scotland's COVID deaths, with more than 3,000 people losing their lives there since March last year. The advice handed to the First Minister in 3 separate reports was that more had to be done to protect social care, and that should have been consulted on as far back as 2018. Instead, that consultation didn't open until over a year later. It closed in September 2019, 6 months before Scotland's first COVID wave. But in that 6 months, the guidance was never updated and no updates were ever published. Crucially, that means care homes were left to face the pandemic with guidance almost a decade old and hopelessly out of date. We know that the Scottish Government is now reviewing this guidance, but it's far too late for too many grieving families. Isn't it just a fact that had the First Minister and her government acted on this sooner and brought forward that guidance, demanded before COVID struck, that some lives in those care homes could have been saved?
First Minister.
Again, no, I don't accept that. Just firstly, can I round off on the previous question, because I didn't say there were no issues with PPE. What I took the time to do was set out properly what those issues were. They weren't the issues that Ruth Davidson had said. The issues were around distribution and making sure we had the right types, and then building that domestic supply chain. So I know that doesn't suit the sound bites that Ruth Davidson wants to hurl across the chamber, but I actually spend each and every day dealing with the fine detail of these issues, and that's what I try to share with the public. On the issue of care homes, it's simply not true to say that there wasn't guidance issued to care homes. There was guidance issued to care homes right at the start of the pandemic. We have taken steps to amend that guidance as our knowledge and understanding of exactly what it is we were dealing with developed, and we will continue to do that. Again, I have been and will continue to be very candid. I think if we could turn the clock back, and if we could have then the knowledge that we have now about the nature of the pandemic we were dealing with, we would have done certain things differently in care homes. And I desperately wish we could have that time again, but we have made sure, both in terms of guidance, the focus on infection prevention and control in care homes, the use of testing when our knowledge developed to allow that to change, and of course more recently the focus we have had, criticised, or certainly by implication criticised just a couple of weeks ago by Ruth Davidson in her questions about vaccination, but because we have focused over recent weeks on making sure not just that we offered the vaccine to every older person in a care home, but we actually got the vaccine to every older person in a care home. We are now seeing that rapid reduction in deaths in care homes, which I'm not sure, although we have to wait and see the figures, will be exactly mirrored in all other parts of the UK. So there are lessons to learn every day in this, and I take that very, very seriously. But I don't think Ruth Davidson does any favours to anybody involved in this just to mischaracterise some of the really difficult challenges that we have been and continue to deal with.
Ruth Davidson.
Let me read directly from the report so there's no mischaracterisation. The First Minister talks about the guidance issued to care homes. Let me read it, page 21. Flu pandemic guidance published in 2012, designed for health and social care in England, was issued to health and social care in Scotland, despite the fact that her government had been told they had to update that guidance in 2018. It wasn't open to consultation until 2019, and even when the consultation had shut 6 months before COVID hit, they still hadn't published it. 2 years of failure in telling social care, accommodation and care homes what they should be doing and how they should be doing it. Now, throughout this pandemic, the First Minister has sought to build a reputation on how she's handled this virus, but the truth is her government was less prepared than it should have been, and it is set out in black and white in today's Audit Scotland report. Mistakes were made by this government, mistakes that cost the health of frontline workers, mistakes that cost the lives of care home residents, mistakes that built up over a decade of delay. This report from the Auditor-General makes it plain that her government was warned again and again and again. There were years where this First Minister could have acted. What stopped her?
Minister.
I just don't think it bears any real or serious scrutiny. I've sought to do nothing over the past 10 months, almost a year now, other than every single day do my best and make sure the government was doing its best to steer this country as safely through this pandemic as we possibly can. And that is still my focus each and every single day, no matter the attempts Ruth Davidson might want to make to change that. So that's what I will do. I've admitted mistakes all along. I will continue to make sure the government is seeking to learn from mistakes as we go. And I, for as long as I live, will regret the toll that this virus has taken, particularly on the older members of our community and those living in care homes. But I also know that because of some of the decisions we've taken, and much, much more than that, because of the efforts of health and social care workers across the country, we can stand here in Scotland and say that we have a lower number of cases than other parts of the UK. We have a lower number of deaths, proportionately far too high, and don't anybody misunderstand the point I'm making, far too high, but lower certainly than England, than in Wales, and we continue to try to take the steps every single day to make sure we are reducing the impact of this virus. So that's all I seek to do every day right now, and it's all I will continue to seek to do. And I'll go back to Ruth Davidson wants to quote the Audit Scotland report, so I will do that too. Staff across the NHS and Scottish Government have worked hard in challenging circumstances. The Scottish Government and NHS responded quickly. The actions that were taken prevented the NHS from becoming overwhelmed. What they describe as the initial difficulties in supplying and distributing, which I talked about PPE, were resolved. Supply now meets demand, and I could go on. The Scottish Government worked to improve the support available for the health and social care workforce during the pandemic, and of course it goes on to the steps we're now taking to rebuild and remobilise the health service. So, I will continue to try to make sure the government learns lessons, but each and every single day, for as long as it takes, I will stay focused on leading this country as safely as possible through these circumstances.
Labour's interim leader Jackie Baillie calmly stepped up and concluded the First Minister is either negligent or incompetent.
The issues highlighted by the Audit Scotland report are so important I make no apology for covering this again. The First Minister says that this pandemic is unprecedented, and she's right. But today's report from Audit Scotland makes clear a pandemic should have been anticipated. The government knew it could threaten the lives of people across Scotland. They were told the social care system would struggle to cope, and they were warned that access to protective equipment for our nurses and doctors just simply wasn't good enough. But now we learn that they didn't act on any of these warnings. In 2015, 2016, 2018, the government received clear recommendations that they simply failed to act on. Exercise Silver Swan, Exercise Cygnus, Exercise Iris, all identified problems, but the government was just too slow to act. As a result, the areas that were neglected, according to Audit Scotland, and I quote, became areas of significant challenge during the COVID-19 pandemic. The First Minister referenced flu planning, but the flu pandemic planning the government did carry out repeatedly highlighted vulnerabilities in PPE supplies and in social care, the very areas of challenge in this pandemic. If the Scottish Government had acted in advance, we would have been in a better position to respond, whatever the virus was. First Minister, you had warning after warning after warning. So was your failure to act negligence or incompetence?
First Minister.
I'm not even going to respond to that because it is actually quite demeaning to people, not me, but to people across government, across the country, who've worked every single day to try to deal with this crisis. I've already alluded to Silver Swan, Cygnus and Iris. All of these lessons were properly embedded into the national and local pandemic guidance. But I come back to the point, and actually, in doing this, I'm actually acknowledging what I think is a real criticism of this government and many other governments as well. And it's one, while I think the Audit Scotland report is really important, I actually think it is a point that is missed from the Audit Scotland report. This was not a flu pandemic. Jackie Baillie says that we should have anticipated a pandemic. Almost on the first day, certainly the first week that I was in government as the Health Secretary, I was briefed on the potential for a pandemic. It was a flu pandemic, and we did lots of preparing. We had a flu pandemic in 2009, and we learned lessons from that as well. I think one of the significant issues we have to reflect on is the fact that not enough of our planning and preparedness was for the actual nature of the pandemic that we've been dealing with. COVID and SARS-type viruses are very, very different to flu. So these are lessons that we have been learning and will continue to learn. I simply don't think it is true or borne out by the facts that we weren't prepared on PPE, although we did have, as I have acknowledged, not just today but previously, we had issues in terms of the distribution of PPE early on, which we took early action to resolve. And in terms of care homes, guidance was in place for care homes that we have adapted and evolved as our understanding of this virus has adapted and evolved. So in the fullness of time, there will be real, proper, detailed scrutiny. I believe we might still be the first government in the UK that has committed to a full public inquiry. But for now, I and my ministers will continue to get on with the job of making sure we're taking the country through this, getting more people vaccinated, suppressing this virus so that we get back to normal as quickly as we can.
Jackie Baillie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I make no criticism of the staff, who I think have been absolutely hard-working and brilliant throughout this, but the First Minister needs to stop hiding behind them, because this is a matter of leadership, and that is something she is responsible for. Can I repeat to her, flu pandemic planning that the government did carry out repeatedly highlighted vulnerabilities in PPE supplies and in social care. Had you paid attention to that, as you say you did, we would not be in this position. Presiding Officer, nowhere has the impact of the pandemic been more distressing than in our care homes. 1 in every 3 people to have lost their lives from COVID-19 have been in care homes. That's over 3,000 families bereaved by an epidemic that raced through our care homes, the very places we expect our elderly and our vulnerable to be safe. But concerns about the ability of social care to cope during a pandemic were highlighted 5 years ago by Exercise Cygnus. Equally, Exercise Silver Swan recommended that the government, and I quote, ensure a wide-range understanding of plans for distribution of PPE and prioritisation of key staff. That recommendation was made in April 2016. It was the end of March 2020, nearly 4 years later, and when the country was already gripped by the pandemic, before the Scottish Government had a PPE distribution model for social care. We know the PPE was not adequate. There was initially a shortage of supply because health and social care staff told us so. I see the First Minister shakes her head, but these are the very staff that we praise for their efforts, and they were telling us what was going wrong. Had the First Minister listened to the warnings about the threat facing social care in a pandemic, and yes, in the context of flu pandemic planning too, lives could have been saved. Why didn't she?
First Minister.
Firstly, I have, on not one single day since this pandemic struck, hidden or tried to hide in any way. In fact, on the days, many of the days, I think, when I've been seeking, to the best of my ability, to lead this country through the pandemic, Jackie Baillie has been writing letters to the BBC trying to stop me briefing the public on a daily basis. So perhaps it is the fact that this government has shown leadership that Jackie Baillie finds quite so difficult to take. But it is because we did learn lessons from the swine flu pandemic we had in 2009 and the exercises that were done, that we had a stockpile of PPE at the start of this pandemic. And as I said earlier on, that's why we never once ran out of PPE. And the early issues we faced in terms of the distribution of PPE within the health service, we quickly resolved. There are, to this day, ongoing concerns that we listen to very carefully from staff about the precise nature of the PPE and whether it is adequate to protect them from the virus, particularly as we face new variants. And our clinical advisors listen to that and discuss that so that we can respond as necessary. In addition to that, as I've already said, we took additional steps to top up the PPE supplies that care home providers already had. So we have taken all of these steps. Has everything gone as we would have wanted? No. We have made mistakes. We've done things that, had we had the knowledge we have now then, we would have done differently. And we learn from those as we go. But every single day, this government, with the dedication of people, not just in our health and social care workforce, but in many different sectors of our society, have tried to get through this as well as we possibly can, and we will continue to do that every single day. And, you know, Jackie Baillie talks about care homes. It's because we learned the lessons from care homes earlier this year that we made the decision that we were going to focus on getting the maximum number of people in care homes vaccinated, not just offered the vaccine, but vaccinated, even if that slowed down the rest of the programme early on in it. And that was, certainly by implication, being criticised by Jackie Baillie and Ruth Davison just a couple of weeks ago. And I think that says it all. They'll criticise whatever we do, but we'll continue to get on with the job of keeping the people of this country as safe as we can.
Jackie Baillie.
Presiding Officer, what I'm very clear about is that there was no leadership in preparing for this pandemic. The First Minister referenced stockpiles of PPE. We know from staff on the ground that they were inadequate and they were also well out of date. And the whole point of this is not to learn after the event, but actually to learn beforehand. So we put in measures to prevent the scale of death that we witnessed. Presiding Officer, the evidence is that when presented with recommendations, the government simply did not listen. They were too slow to prepare and too slow to act. We may have reacted quickly, and I welcome that. And I thank NHS and care staff for doing that. But we were simply not prepared. So here is an opportunity to listen and to act. Don't just clap for health and social care workers. Listen and act when they ask you for enhanced PPE to protect them and those they care for from the new COVID variants. We know the rate of hospital contracted COVID is still far too high. Since the start of the pandemic, at least 3,115 people have contracted COVID-19 in hospital. In the week ending 24th January, the Scottish Government rejected calls from Scottish Labour for enhanced PPE to protect staff and patients from the new variants, dismissing the concerns of the very staff whose attitude and whose evidence we all value so highly. That same week, at least 228 people contracted COVID-19 on hospital wards. So will the First Minister listen? Will she act? And will she give health and care staff the enhanced protection they need and they deserve?
First Minister.
We didn't dismiss those calls. I'm not qualified as a politician, former lawyer, to decide the technical specifications of PPE. That's what I have clinical advisors for, and every time health or social care staff say that they think they need a higher specification, we ask our clinical advisors to consider that and to come to a view. That has been done up until now on a Four Nations basis, so we will never dismiss those claims. The advice to me and to the government is that the specification of PPE that is being used is appropriate for even the new variant of COVID. If that advice changes, so too will the decisions we take on PPE. I would never, not just as First Minister, although that is the most important point here, but as the sister of somebody who works in the front line of the NHS, as the sister-in-law of somebody, I would never dismiss the views of those in the front line of the National Health Service. So we will continue to take those decisions based on the best advice, and we will continue to learn lessons, just as we learned lessons from the 2009 pandemic, from the exercises, but we'll also learn the lessons of the real lessons of this one, which is that we must learn as we go, and we must not assume that the pandemics we're going to face are the ones that we have faced in the past. I think the real criticism here of governments like this one is that we should have been better prepared for a SARS-type virus and relied less on flu preparedness. Now, I'm able to say that, but let's engage properly on these things rather than just chuck sound bites across a parliamentary chamber.
Lib Dem leader Willie Rennie veered away from the pandemic into education and the expected publication of an independent report.
How can the people of Scotland judge the First Minister on her record on education if she won't publish the OECD report until after the election?
First Minister.
The timetable of the OECD review that is underway right now has been set by the OECD. They are carrying this out independently for the Scottish Government, and it would be wrong for us to seek to dictate to them how they do that or on what timescale they do that. The work was delayed because of the pandemic and not least because of restrictions the OECD put on the ability of their staff to travel overseas. But that is work that the OECD is taking forward, and I look forward to its conclusions, and I look forward to making sure that we can take forward any recommendations that they make.
Willie Rennie.
Is the First Minister seriously expecting us to believe that of all the months of the year that the OECD could have picked, they just happened to insist on the one immediately following the election? The Scottish Government has the report already, so the First Minister should publish it now. The independence of this report is in question because of the interference. The Scottish Government and its agencies have timetabled months to alter the report. There's a special group established to make changes, but that's dominated by the SQA and Education Scotland, the very same bodies that are under the microscope of the OECD report. And we all know this because it is in the government documents that we secured under freedom of information. So how can anyone have confidence in the independence of this report if the government has the opportunity to meddle with it for months on end?
First Minister.
I'm not entirely sure I think I am sure what Willie Rennie is suggesting here, but the idea that the OECD would allow to happen what he has just suggested is happening is completely outrageous, actually. The OECD is a respected organisation. It is carrying out this review for the Scottish Government independently. It has set its timetable. The preliminary report that the Scottish Government has received is purely for accuracy checking. It is not an opportunity to influence the content or rewrite any part of the report, and I don't think the OECD would wear that, even if the Scottish Government was to attempt it, which it is not doing. As I understand it, draft findings will be shared with stakeholders, providing an opportunity for key partners to inform the final report, and the independent report will be published when the OECD decides that it should be published. And if the Scottish Government was trying to dictate either the way in which the OECD did this or the timetable to which they did it, I'm pretty sure Willie Rennie would be standing up here right now saying how outrageous and unacceptable that was. So we will do this properly, and I trust and have confidence, given how well thought of an organisation it is, the OECD, to do this and to do it extremely well.
And for the Scottish Greens, Patrick Harvie focused on poverty.
We've all seen the pictures of hundreds of people queuing in the snow for emergency food in Glasgow's George Square last week. It's an indictment on the failure to tackle poverty and hunger in Scotland. This level of desperation is happening in the city that both the First Minister and I represent, and the charities which feed people in Glasgow have warned that the funding isn't getting to where it's needed. Last year, 80 organisations got the resources they need to carry out this emergency relief. This year, it's expected to be less than half that number. Just as one example, the Children's Wood, which runs a holiday club for children in Maryhill, has not received funding. Does the First Minister think it's acceptable that getting food to hungry children is a postcode lottery in Glasgow? And will she commit to universal solutions, such as extending free school meals to all primary pupils all year round?
First Minister.
I've already made that commitment. We have made clear if we're returned to government, then that is exactly what we will do. Free school meals to all primary pupils and children in early years all year round. So I hope other parties across the chamber will join us in that. And then whoever emerges victorious from the election in May, we know that that policy will be implemented. In terms of the wider issue, there is much more that we all need to do to tackle poverty, and like Patrick Harvie, I was appalled and disturbed at the photograph that circulated a few days ago. I asked my officials to look into the circumstances of that, to engage with relevant partners to see what more we can do. We have increased funding throughout the pandemic for food insecurity. We have increased funding to specifically help those who are having poverty exacerbated because of the pandemic. Indeed, the Finance Secretary announced even more funding for that just yesterday. So we will continue to take whatever steps we can to help those who are finding it toughest as a result of what everybody is dealing with right now. But we're also, of course, taking the crucial steps to try to deal with the underlying causes of poverty. Perhaps the most significant thing that has happened in that regard this week is the launch of the new Scottish Child Payment, the only part of the UK with this scheme which is about lifting children and, by extension, families out of poverty. So we will continue to do what we can to try to consign poverty to history in our country.
You're listening to The Week in Holyrood. I'm Charles Fletcher. Coming up in this half hour, what next for furlough? And Boris Johnson on Joe Biden. Scotland's former First Minister Alex Salmond says he's ready to appear before the Committee on the Scottish Government handling of harassment complaints next week. He's due to give evidence on oath on Wednesday. I'll bring you coverage in the next edition of The Week in Holyrood. Scotland's Finance Secretary Kate Forbes has set aside more money for hospitality, extended the freeze on business rates and crafted more money for local government. We await news on the UK Chancellor continuing the furlough scheme. I asked the First Minister about potential extension to that in her daily briefing.
And lastly, today, Charles Fletcher from Caledonia Media.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. The UK budget is expected in just under 2 weeks' time. I wonder what stage you're at in persuading the Chancellor to extend the furlough scheme.
Those discussions will be ongoing. The Finance Secretary will have already made representations to the Chancellor and will make more representations between now and the budget on furlough, which I think it is essential that we see the furlough scheme continue, and in a whole host of other areas, and hopefully these will be constructive discussions that lead to constructive outcomes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
The UK Government will set out its budget on the 3rd of March. Finance Secretary Kate Forbes says the Chancellor must be clear about continuing and extending financial support.
Presiding Officer, when I presented the budget last month, I made clear that if resources allowed, I would extend 100% non-domestic rates relief for properties in the retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation sectors for all of next year. I am now in a position to provide that certainty to business, meeting the #1 ask of the business community and demonstrating our commitment to supporting the economy. To ensure that resources are targeted at those who need it most, we're working with councils to ensure the application process will be live ahead of bills being issued. In addition to extending 100% relief for these sectors, we will continue 100% relief for newspapers publishing in next year with careful consideration of the NUJ's conditions, and we will defer the removal of charitable rates relief from mainstream independent schools to the 1st of April 2022. The impacts of COVID will last beyond this academic year, and we need to continue to support a longer-term programme to enable children to catch up on missed education. Therefore, we will provide a further £60 million to support and accelerate that process. This will be available for purposes including ensuring that the levels of teaching and support staff in schools can continue to meet the needs of children and young people across all parts of Scotland. We're aware of the financial impact the pandemic has had on households and want to provide support during this time. So I'm also today confirming that we will invest an additional £100 million next year to help low-income households in the year ahead. We will announce more details of this investment in due course when it has been fully discussed with COSLA. I want to ensure that the UK Government will not claw back any of the support we provide, for example, through reduced benefit payments, and will therefore be asking UK ministers to help us help people in hardship during this difficult time.
In a little over a week, we'll know the name of the new leader of the Labour Party in Scotland. MSPs Monica Lennon and Anas Sarwar are battling for the title to become the 10th leader since the Parliament rose again in Edinburgh. Anas Sarwar tells me he has bold ambition for Labour. First, we hear from Monica Lennon.
I want to pursue what I'm doing right now because I really believe that we have big inequalities in our country that we need to take face on and resolve. We're not through the pandemic yet. We're trying to get the vaccine rolled out. Getting the vaccine into people's arms has to be the priority. We need to eliminate COVID-19 and then we need to start to recover and take the country forward in a new direction. But I'm not naive. The issue about independence and Scotland's future in the union and the constitutional arrangements, these issues are still there. People still have views and have opinions, and we all have different opinions. So I've said in this contest, if you want a candidate who's not going to talk about that and try and ignore it, then that's not me. I will always listen to people, even people who don't agree with us. I think that's the most important thing that we need to do in politics. I've said that I don't believe in independence, and pursuing a referendum is not my priority. I don't think it is the priority for Scotland. But at the end of the day, if in the future people in Scotland say they want to have a referendum, that should be for people in Scotland to decide. And I will never hide behind Boris Johnson or any Prime Minister, because I do believe that the people of Scotland are sovereign. I do believe in self-determination, and I do believe that reform of the United Kingdom and of Scotland is required. I mean, there's a big frustration that Westminster is out of touch and that power is hoarded in the House of Commons. But you look at Holyrood and you see the frustration from colleagues and communities locally, local government, because we do have a very centralising government in the SNP at the moment. So we've had the SNP in charge for, almost 14 years. We know what we get from Tory governments. I think people want something different, and I think that's what Scottish Labour can offer.
You are the party that delivered devolution. You brought Parliament back to Scotland. Should we have Devo Max?
I'm very open to more powers coming to Scotland. I think, first of all, it has to be said that there's a lot of frustration that the SNP haven't used the existing powers of the Scottish Parliament to full effect, and they haven't used resources in Scotland fairly to empower local government and to allow communities to make decisions for themselves. So that needs to change. That's why I want to get the SNP out of power. And I think an SNP majority would be so unhealthy, because I know people in the SNP grassroots, particularly younger members, who feel really let down by SNP ministers who they believe are out of touch and not as progressive as they want them to be. Charles, I mentioned the drug death crisis. That's one example where I do believe we need to see some change. The powers over drug law, that rests with the House of Commons, and the Misuse of Drugs Act is 50 years old. It's not fit for purpose. We've lost the war on drugs. And I really do believe that we need a public health approach. That's not about putting people in prison because of an addiction. It's about helping people to get well, access to treatment, access to residential rehab, and of course harm reduction to help people at every stage of their illness and recovery. So I do believe that we need to see those powers come to the Scottish Parliament. But that's not to let the SNP off the hook, because remember that they cut the budgets for alcohol and drug partnerships, and I put down a motion with regret to ask the Public Health Minister, Joe Fitzpatrick, to leave government and to allow someone else to take over. He's gone, but we can't just change one minister. We need a transformation in this country. Nicola Sturgeon has now apologised for the handling of the drugs crisis, and she's now put substantial money back into services. But it's not about just picking a side and saying, well, it's all about the SNP or the Tories. I think we have to look at what our country needs. That would be my starting point. And if that means powers coming to the Scottish Parliament, I will always fight for that.
Look, it's a really challenging time. There's no point sugarcoating that. I mean, we will have, a few weeks in the Parliament, whoever the new leader is, and then they go straight from that into an election campaign. So really only 8 weeks till after the end of this contest to get ready for that election campaign. And look, the polls are obviously have us in a very difficult place. So we've got to hit the ground running. I'm aware of the scale of that challenge. I'm not naive about the scale of that challenge, but I genuinely think that we can have a message and a platform that can resonate with people across Scotland. That's about bringing our country back together again rather than dividing our country. That's about focusing on the people's priorities right now, and is about our COVID recovery. And I think we can hopefully get that message digitally across in the coming weeks.
And it is very important to stress, is it not, that for you, the target has to be bringing the Labour Party in Scotland back into second place and then aiming further to become First Minister in 5 years' time?
Look, I've not been. Look, I'm not one of those that we've seen this. You'll have heard this several times, Charles. We've had lots of Labour leaders over the years in Scotland, and whenever anyone's a leadership candidate or whenever any leader is elected, it seems to be the case that they think they need to act macho, they need to broaden the shoulders, and they need to make bold statements about, we're on the verge of returning a Labour government or returning a Labour First Minister. I'm not going to be that kind of leader. I'm going to lead with humility and honesty. And part of that humility and honesty is recognising that we're in a really bad place in the polls. And that's, one, first of all, fighting for our survival in the next 8 weeks. And then hopefully getting ourselves in a position to be a credible opposition, but I then use that platform over the coming years to make that credible opposition into a credible alternative, so we can aspire to have a Labour government and a Labour First Minister. But look, this is going to take a time. It's going to take a long time. We've got a lot of work to do to win back people's trust and to make Labour feel relevant again to their lives. And I'm willing to put in the hard work day and night to make that happen.
Forgive me for suggesting that maybe you're trying to lower the expectations of some people, perhaps not least those of us in the media.
No, it's not about managing expectations down. I want to give bold expectations on what people can expect from the Labour Party, but I want to do it in a way that is reflective of our current state and is honest. And looking at the polls just now, of course, I would love us to win the election in May, but I think it looks difficult for us to win the election in May. I would love for us to establish ourselves as the main opposition in Scotland, and then to use that as a platform to be a credible alternative. But I'm not going to pretend that that's changing one person at the top and everything automatically gets good again. We've not given Scotland the Labour Party it deserves in recent times, and that's my job if I'm elected, to give people the Labour Party they need and deserve.
The leader of the UK Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, has set out his big policy goals this week. Central to it is his belief there is a need to stand up against inequality. Keir Starmer claims if you have government and business working together, you can do more than what the Tories propose, which he says is just business and no government.
I think that COVID has shifted the axis on economic policy. Both what is necessary and what is possible have changed. The age in which the government did little but collect and distribute revenue is over. The mistakes of the last decade have made sure of that. I believe people are now looking for more from their government, like they were after the Second World War. They're looking for a government to help them through difficult times, to provide security, to build a better future for them and their families. If I were Prime Minister, I would introduce a new British recovery bond. This could raise billions to invest in local communities, in jobs and in businesses. It could help build the infrastructure of the future, investing in science, in skills, in technology and British manufacturing. It would also provide security for savers and give millions of people a proper stake in Britain's future. I believe in the power of active, enterprising government, working alongside British business. A new partnership with business, one where we have high expectations of business and where business can have high expectations of Labour, is pivotal to my leadership and to my vision for the future. Do we want to go back and try to repair what we had before? Or do we move forward to a better and different economy? And I think this is a moral and political choice that we now have to make.
The UK Parliament is in recess this week, but Boris is making himself busy, appearing on the CBS News programme in the United States, Face the Nation. In it, he says nice things about President Joe Biden, but claims he's nicked some of his policies and slogans.
You have not yet met President Biden, though you're about to have this virtual meeting. You did have a phone call. Back in 2019, he referred to you, as I'm sure you know, as the physical and emotional clone of Donald Trump. Are you concerned you're going to start off on the wrong foot?
I've had, I think, already 2 long and very good conversations with the president, and we had a really good exchange, particularly about climate change and what he wants to do. We want to build back better together, particularly in the run-up to the COP summit in November in Glasgow this year, which we hoped will be a physical incarnation of the leaders of the world, to agree what we hope will be a fantastic thing, which is everybody to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but also making pledges on the way, what they're going to do to get there by 2030.
On the issue of Ireland, you may have some difference here. President Biden doesn't want you to put that peace agreement in Northern Ireland at risk at all, has made clear that border needs to stay open and you need to adhere to that EU-UK agreement from December. Can you commit and reassure the U.S. Congress and the U.S. President that you will do so in all circumstances? Stick to that agreement.
You bet. This is fundamental for us. The Anglo-Irish agreement, the peace agreement, the Good Friday process, the Belfast agreement, these agreements are absolutely crucial.
And the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Our continued stability, our continued stability and success as a UK, and our success. I have a great relationship with Dublin, with Micheál Martin, the Irish Taoiseach, and we're going to work together to do some great things. And Margaret, be in no doubt, we don't want to do anything to jeopardise the achievements of the Northern Irish peace process.